progress being made, nor actually very much interest in the international community in finding a solution to this. So year after year, the new governments come into countries, they say, I really want to fix this problem. I'd like to get straight with the international community and invite new investment into my country. And that's been failing country after country with, I think, dire consequences. Thank you very much. World Bank designation. They paid $10 billion out in 2021. That has tripled now in 2023. So $30 billion of payout from the poorest countries, actually making those payments or being responsible for them. And to put that in perspective, the IDA 20, which is the operable World Bank program for those countries, is only $23 billion over 3 years. And the next one, the next 3 years, is going to be smaller than that in terms of the amount of money that the world puts in grant money for these countries. So to compare that, they're putting out $30 billion, and in the only really big program to put in is 23 over 3 years. So you can see the unsustainability of that system. So as people think about, can foreign aid solve this problem, right now you would be looking at needing a huge, giant increase at a time when the countries, the advanced economies in their negotiations are actually looking to reduce the amount that they're putting into their countries. So.
Okay, I'd also like to important. It happened relatively quickly. So in the 2000s and 2010s, China really expanded its lending and created the terms that it wanted. So, and China lends differently. One is there's non-disclosure clauses in the contract so that people can't see what the deal is that's being done. One is, and you mentioned the escrow accounts. So for example, Angola borrows from China. China helps build things in Angola, but then Angola's oil is exported through, with the proceeds going through an escrow account controlled by China. And so that gives substantial influence, and that's operating in many of the countries. Which is different from the system, and I think that, and I advocated that there be a more clear agreement on the international scale that governments not borrow by giving up collateral. Think of if the U.S. government, in order to issue a treasury bond, was asked by China or Japan or other lenders, we would like to have control of your road system if you don't pay us. That wouldn't be a workable system, but that actually is the norm in many of the developing countries. And so the numbers are staggering now. I gave you the size. The debt service has tripled from 2021 to 2023 to $30 billion, of which $16 billion is going to China. So they're more than half of the extraction that's coming from the developing from the poorer developing countries. Okay, so how do we change that? One is, and I mentioned in the Article 4 consultations, the IMF could try to get countries to disclose how much they owe. And that would be a starting point to getting it restructured. As long as it's secret or under the table, it's hard to know what the legitimacy of the contracts are. I think another thing that could be looked at is collective action clauses within bond covenants and within lending arrangements. There is the idea that if you're in a class of lenders, you can have with either majority rule or a 75% or an 85% collective action, you can agree to restructure the debt. What's happening right now is the countries are having to wait for unanimity among their creditors, meaning China has to agree with the same restructuring that the U.S. government might. And so that a change would be to have clauses within contracts. The World Bank often has negative pledge clauses. I invoked one of those in Angola. I mentioned the escrow situation with China. That violated a negative pledge clause that the World Bank had in its loan contracts. Those aren't being enforced by the World Bank in other countries. So that again would be an avenue to try to put pressure on the international system to give a more balanced opportunity for the debtor countries. Because the reality right now, the world system is working actively and almost solely on behalf of the creditors. And as I've just described, China is the biggest creditor, so the world system is working aggressively to help the creditors against the developing countries that we have so much national interest at stake here. Worked out in terms of their investment. So what could we do to incentivize them to be part of this? I mentioned, I think there has to be a shift. As long as you have the G20 and the Paris Club dominating the process, it's working heavily in China's favor. So rethinking that and the U.S. government actually taking a position that this process is not working. So far, they've taken the position, well, if we're just patient and keep doing this, but as I described, the payout to China is bigger and bigger every year. And so I think to incentivize it, we have to, want to change the system and then really work through with the advanced economies to think about what is a way to work with. We would like China and other countries to be making productive investments in developing countries, but not ones that extract resources and end up with only benefiting China. So how do you find a fairer system that actually works? Right now, there's no discussion of that. So each country is thinking pretty rapidly across creditors. China has so far taken the position that they understand that present value, but also want to make sure that they don't get their money out later than other creditors, which is so those two concepts don't actually work in combination, and so that means from the Paris Club and the international system to say, look, we're doing comparability of treatment. That was the agreement within the G20. So let's get on with it. And then more forceful decision process. I tried to do that from the World Bank in setting up the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, GSDR, which started at the end of 22 and then met in 2023 with the idea it was supposed to be a forum where the debtor was the debtor country, so Zambia, which is trying hard to have a better life for their people, could sit at the same table with their creditors, including China, and actually talk about their debt, because that hadn't been going on. The problem is that roundtable has not been assertive in describing this kind of situation, that net present value is the way to have comparability of treatment. Sorry to get nerdy, but the reason that this is important is billions. You read the clip from Hichilema, the president of Zambia, saying $13 billion is at stake and the international community is not stepping up. But this is the core of it, that there hasn't been direction from the international community on how to evaluate comparability of treatment in a way that will bring China along in a restructuring. Okay, within a contract. So that means some kind of international agreement that you're not going to have collateral and non-disclosure clauses. I forced the issue on Ecuador in 2019 when they were doing a debt restructuring where they had signed under the previous government, so the communist government had signed with China an oil contract that was under a non-disclosure clause, and no one had seen it for years, what that contract required, and that means where the money was going. So we were able to force, but only up to a point, that historical contracts, not the current one that they were under, that required the full force of refusal to lend into the program until there was some disclosure. So the world saw that China had been able to use the very best law firms in the U.S. and the U.K. to write clauses in the contracts that no one, that not even the World Bank or the IMF could get through to see what was in the contract. So one is pushing that issue. Number two, no order here, having the private sector be more the recipient. You know, right now a lot of the countries are allowed to be government dominated and government focused, and it'd be better to have it distributed, because right now the corruption can be concentrated in a small group. Number three is statutory reforms in the UK and in the money centers, in New York and London, that didn't give so much pressure, advantage to the creditor. The whole system's been written to be dominated by the creditors, which means China has a strong incentive to keep lending because there's never losses. And so having statutory changes that lessen the attachment power of the bondholders. We're talking about Euro bondholders that are writing the contracts in a way that benefits basically rich people within the advanced economy. One that is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the U.S. puts real constraint on the ability of Americans, of U.S. people to operate abroad, because they're under such a high bar ethically, higher than the whole rest of the world, that they can't travel to the countries and actually get engaged. So one would be to have the U.S. comply with the OECD standards for ethics as people are working with countries, because China is simply not, and their business people are not constrained, and so that gives them a huge advantage within negotiations. I mentioned the need for losses. The moral hazard problem that Josh mentioned is a very real one. If you never take losses, the incentive is to lend without thinking about the quality of the loan that you're making. You just go ahead and make the loan. So that's kind of the dominant part of the system right now. If you lend to a sovereign, the whole international system comes down to support you, the creditor, no matter how dumb your loan was. And so that has to be fixed and changed. That actually applies to the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks and the IMF. They have what is called preferred creditor treatment, meaning they always get paid first, no matter how unsupportable the loan might have been. So they're themselves part of the problem. You can go into a country, make a loan that you look at and say, boy, it can be very hard for them to repay this loan, and yet you're going to get repaid first. One more, maybe the most important one, is the currency systems in the countries. There's not an international consensus, strong enough at least, that people in countries should be allowed to keep their money. So what we have is a system where the governments control the money and then devalue it, which is a way for the governments to provide corruption into their practices. It's, in fact, if you say what's the single biggest source of corruption, it's the multiple exchange rate system. So if you think about Nigeria, why is Nigeria, which is an oil superpower, why are 25% of the people in extreme poverty, and it's getting more? And the reason, in my view, is they have a multiple exchange rate system where if you are friends and family, you get a better exchange rate, and everybody else gets the worst one. So it concentrates. Ethiopia has been doing that, and so these are countries that could be rich and could make that change. Argentina is a clear example where it's a country with huge resources, but the government controls the peso. So what do you think is going to happen? The people just get poorer and poorer. So that would be that would be part of the system to reduce corruption. I think there should be a very firm international consensus that countries should not have favorable, differential exchange rates for different people, and that central banks should in general try to have their currencies be stable rather than unstable. But that isn't what economics is doing right now. They fully endorse the idea of free-floating exchange rates that offer this huge ground for corruption.
Okay, Paris being the convener of restructuring negotiations to form some new organization, formally or informally.
When you say we, you mean you, the Hudson Institute, or
I'm a think tank guy.
the U.S. government? So this gets
G7, I don't know.
More of it. So the G7, I think the deputies are meeting in Florence, Italy today or yesterday, I think a starting point, and we should recognize the U.S. is the world's biggest economy, the biggest military power, and the world really looks up or wants to look up to the U.S. This took a massive setback because of Afghanistan. We're still seeing the consequences of that. And so you saw in Niger, I was in Niger a year ago. It's a really important country. Many people haven't heard of it. So it's north of Nigeria. It's twice as big as Texas. It has oil, it has uranium. It's an important mainstay within the world. And so I went and gave an important speech in Niger, wanting to strengthen or at least to provide some kind of international support. They, some months later on, related to my visit, had a coup, the military took over, and now the U.S. Closed the base. It was announced this week. And so this is emblematic of the fading U.S. power that's going on. So when you say we and the Paris Club, France is a strong player within the international system. And so they are currently the chair of each debt restructuring, and firms based in Paris are the private sector firms that carry out the restructuring. So it would take a real discussion on the international stage to say, look, and China's been clear that I'm sorry, for people that don't know the background, the Paris Club for 50 years has been the arbiter of the restructuring for countries. So in the 1980s, with the Latin debt crisis, it was restructured using the system I described. The Paris Club, chaired by France, decides on the terms, and then the private sector is requested to go along with the terms that are determined by the countries chaired by France. So that still is the system going on. So I think what I suggested was a system maybe within the G20 Common Framework or within the Paris Club where there would be a recognition that the debtors could choose to work with a variety of creditors in order to work out the restructuring, in order to incentivize. Meaning if the Eurobond holders wanted to reach a deal, meaning a write-off with the country, they would be allowed to go ahead and do that. And that would at least allow the country to then go back to the official creditors. That's the U.S. Export-Import Bank and the China Export-Import Bank and other official creditors, and say to them, look, we've already reached a deal with the private sector creditors. You should be going along with that because you're rich countries. And they would have a lot of leverage in order to do that. But right now, there's nothing like that on the horizon. So I don't want to put it quite the way. I can envision there being latitude within a Paris Club or a framework centered in Paris that actually got the job done. That would be the goal.
Okay, let's go to the audience. Let's see, in the back there.
The World Bank were created out of the Bretton Woods Conference at the end, in the hope that World War II would end and there would be a reconstruction process for Europe. And they had different roles.
the IMF to more protect the gold standard, and the World Bank to do is what's called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And the first loan was to France, some of the early loans to Luxembourg, and so on. Over the years, those roles changed, but also over the years, there became a proliferation of multilateral development banks that have the same powers as the World Bank. That means preferred creditor treatment. So when they lend, the country has to pay them back. And that applies to, so China has seen this and created two in China, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank currency. And so the country has been able to spend yuan in China. So this was an issue with Mongolia, for example. It's now become, for Argentina, where you're from, China a year ago stepped into the Argentina disaster that was unfolding and did a swap arrangement, which means they're at the top of the capital stack. That means they'll get, the central bank will get paid first by Argentina, even before, I think, I mean, this might be tested before the IMF and the World Bank. It used to be that that kind of lending from China was not recorded in the international statistics because they treated it just as if it's a swap, so there's no loan. Under my tenure at the World Bank, we began collecting that data and disclosing it because in operation it becomes just a very preferred loan that's made from China, from the government of China to countries. So to your question, what kind of lending is going on in Africa, each of these kinds of lending, and it was going up very rapidly. And now all of those are floating rate loans. So as the Federal Reserve has gone from 0 to 5.5%, the profit on those loans is enormous, and there's no technique to restructure those debts.
David can't say this, but I can. Some of us think that this is part of this AIIB and other Chinese banks. Even things like swap lines. There's always a price to pay, and China is always looking out for its own interests. So we have time for.
So if you think about what price, one standard thing is China says, well, we would need to have you make a state-to-state visit to China if we were to go forward with negotiating this loan that you're so interested in. So one of the things going on is the leaders from across Africa, each one makes the pilgrimage to Beijing to see what China really wants in terms of this loan that they're going to make.
Okay, we're over time, but one more question. This gentleman's been waiting patiently.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Todd Wiggins, and Mr. Malpass, I'm going to provide you with a promotion. I'm going to call you Dr. Malpass. But I would also, since this is we're in the midst of an election year, I'd like to ask you what you feel we should be looking at between now and November, and which of the current administration should hire you as their primary advisor going forward.
Maybe another. So I made a point that the world really would like the U.S. to be strong. I really feel that. I went into lots of conferences where they genuinely wanted to know what the U.S. Thought was a good direction. So there is this well of goodwill that you don't see playing out right now. And so I think we really have to work hard to reestablish that in the world, because the alternatives are communism, socialism, and poverty.
Okay, on that note, we've gone over time. You've been a patient audience. I think there's been a lot of very creative ideas advanced here to think about. So I want to thank David Malpass and Joshua Servi, and please join me in giving them a